Every once in a while, a book comes along that gets under your skin, crawls down, it burrows into your gut, takes up residence there, and inevitably, at some point in time, makes its way to your chest and your brain, and you find yourself thinking about it far after you've finished the last page. This, to me, is one of those books. Carcass, cut in half, stunner, slaughter line, spray wash. These words appear in his head and strike him. Destroy him. But they're not just words. They're the blood, the dense smell, the automation, the absence of thought. They burst in on the night, catch him off guard. When he wakes, his body is covered in a film of sweat, because he knows that what awaits is another day of slaughtering humans. Hey, welcome back to the channel. My name is Jason, and here I talk about all things story. Yes, those are the opening lines, the first paragraph, in fact, of Tender is the Flesh by Agustina Bazterrica, translated by Sarah Moses. This is a special book to me, and I know you may think I am a very twisted soul for saying so, but hopefully once I tell you my thoughts and explain why I feel that way, maybe you will feel the same way, or if you have not read this book, go out and pick up a copy for yourself, because I think this is a book that, while not for everybody, should be read for those who can stomach it. So what is the hook? What is Tender is the Flesh about? Well, the world has changed. There's a virus, allegedly, an alleged virus that has infected all animals, wild, captive, and they all must be killed, including pets and livestock, more importantly. And humans find themselves without a primary source of food, most specifically meat, and so they must find a substitute. And that substitute is themselves. And at the center of all of this, our POV character, Marcus Tejo, he works at the slaughterhouse. He slaughters humans for a living. So what did I think? So before I start with character, I should say that I'm extremely pleased that this is not an anti-meat book. This is not vegan propaganda. It could have easily gone in that direction in the hands of a lesser writer. A book that I felt went in that direction is Under the Skin. The film is far better, in my opinion. The book veers into this territory. But anyway, we're not here to talk about that book. We're here to talk about Tender is the Flesh. So, character. Marcos Tejo, he is our protagonist. He is our single POV character for this entire experience. His infant son is dead. He's estranged from his wife. His father is dying in hospice. And he finds himself at odds with what he has to do for a living and what he has lost. So a lot of trauma there, a lot of things to consider for this character, and a lot of things to just deal with. I think the most interesting thing about Marcos in this story is that he feels numb, understandably so, with everything that he's lost in the world he finds himself in. But he travels across this bleak landscape as a ghost, as an observer, for us to experience this. And I think it was masterfully done here because, of course, we want to know how the system works. How does all this come to be? How do they slaughter humans? Why are they slaughtering humans? And because he works for a processing plant, he's a very well-respected individual in this collection of suppliers and distributors, and that we get to experience a vast array of locales. Everything from hunters who own land to, yes, hunt humans, to processing plants, to science labs, to everyday butchers. And again, we're seeing this all through the cold stare of Marcos. But he does find himself often crossing paths with interesting characters. There's a butcher who is seemingly insane, very cold, very calculated, and they have an interesting relationship, as well as his boss at the processing plant, as well as a woman who works at a lab where they are experimenting on humans. Yes, in modern times, we tend to experiment on mice quite often. But now that humans have been relegated to meat or cattle, they're open game as well. And so what I love about this book is you're constantly, in instances like those where you're like, oh, we're using these people to cure cancer or discover all kinds of things we couldn't have done previously. And there's that balancing act of what you could logically justify as something that could be for the greater good. It's still painful because you know the horrors that these humans are having to go through. But back to those peripheral characters, I think through them, they're very distinct, very detailed, and they give us another view, differing perspectives of people who exist in this world. People like ourselves in the modern day when it comes to factory farming, where we're so detached from the process that we've become desensitized to everything. So we don't really think about the suffering a cow has to go through in a factory farming situation when we're eating a hamburger or eating a steak. And so there are people like that who have become so desensitized and separated from the process. But then also we have people who revel in the process, people who enjoy killing, people who enjoy butchering other humans. And it makes you wonder how psychopaths or people who enjoy murder now would fit into this world. And that is definitely explored. And speaking of more revelers, we have, as I mentioned, a man who owns a compound where you can hunt humans. In fact, a lot of celebrities who get in terrible debt offer up their lives. They have to go on this compound and they survive a couple days or a week depending on what their debt is like. And then if they survive, the debt is paid off. If they don't survive, well, they become dinner essentially. So we get a lot of great perspectives in this world. It is all through the lens of Marcos, but because the prose is so utilitarian, it's so on the surface seeming very plain, it gives us a seemingly objective view on this world and the people who inhabit it. So as far as character arc, there's really not much of a character arc. Well, I guess you could argue there is in kind of a George Orwell 1984 way. If you have not read that book, I'm not going to spoil it for you here. Maybe I'll make a spoiler section at the end so I can talk more about that character arc, because it really comes to fruition in the very, very last chapter of this book. But it also seems kind of like the point of this entire thing, right? We have this man who is living in this just terrible, terrible world, and he's lost his child, he's estranged from his wife, his father's dying, and plus he has to kill humans for a living. Like, who really wants to live in a world like that? And so I think the character work is intentionally kind of a flat line. I don't want to say there's no ups and downs, because there definitely are. There's conflict, there's brief moments of action, and we can see this affect Marcos in varying degrees throughout the story. But most of the time, as I said, he feels like a ghost drifting through this bleak landscape to relay the horrors to us. All right, let's move on to the plot. There's really not much of a plot here. One impetus, I guess you could say, or catalyst early on is that Marcus is gifted a human female, and people are allowed to own heads. They can raise them, they can kill them, slaughter them, eat them if they wish, however they see fit. That is kind of the beginning of Marcos's dilemma, and while it is a pivotal part of the story, the bulk of the tale is told through Marcos traveling to these different destinations. So some of these locations he travels to is an abandoned zoo because, as we know, all animals were killed, and it was a special place to him as a child, and there's some interesting encounters that happen there. And as I said earlier, he travels to a lab where humans are experimented on for the betterment of, humans that aren't being used as food, and also a butcher who he has a very, very strange relationship with. And of course, he sees his father at the home where he is slowly dying, and that gives us a better glimpse into what it's like to reach the end of your life if you are not food. There's black markets. There's these group of people known as the scavengers who are essentially, gone mad on the fringe of society, who raid the slaughterhouses when they can to steal meat. But really, there's no big plot. This feels like a tour of the strange world, and it is very, very compelling to read. It's unsettling at times, and I'm sure you can imagine why. But it's one that I honestly couldn't take my eyes away from. I constantly felt the need to go back to this book and just see what was going to happen next, even though, as I said, there's really not a major plot there, with the exception of the female who he was gifted, and that obviously around the midpoint is when that begins to show where that is going. And it in fact is sort of takes us to the end of the tale, bringing Marcos to complete his arc, or maybe not, depending on how you look at it. So let us move on to the writing itself, or as I like to call it, the cinematography of the novel. And this is one of the most interesting parts of this book, I think, aside from, of course, the subject matter. But it is told in third person, present tense, in very plain yet effective language. And this is, as a writer, as a student of the craft, I was very fascinated with why this worked, because you will find yourself noticing exposition dumps. And we do know that that is frowned upon, but for some reason it works here for me. And I don't know if it's because the subject matter we're dealing with, or the way she weaves in action with exposition, or maybe just the passages weren't long enough to really get under my skin. So it's one of those things that really puzzles me, because I think in any other novel, a novel that is told in a very familiar way, I could see this getting in the way. But I also need to talk about Sarah Moses, because I didn't even realize this book was translated from Spanish when I read it until I was quite a ways into it. But the writing is beautiful, the metaphors are beautiful, and even though it is plain, it works in that kind of Hemingway sort of way. And I think it really reflects character too, because as I said, Marcos, he's a numb ghost essentially. He's reporting, he's an observer who doesn't really feel human himself almost sometimes. And the language really emphasizes that. And I think it's one thing I'm gonna have to study a lot more, because I'm always wondering how to form prose, how to make it the most impactful. And here, everything was stripped away. And perhaps that is the power of it, is that it was so simplified. It wasn't trying too hard. And even though there was exposition dumps periodically, it didn't feel obtrusive. But again, I could be wrong about all of this. It could be the fact that we are dealing with a society that raises and kills humans for food, and that is what kind of kept me going on, because I wanted to figure out how this world works and just how people deal with this kind of activity. So let us go back to the opening lines, or the opening paragraph, which I read previously, because it just really exemplifies the mastery of the writing here. And I'll talk about why too. So we have carcass, cut in half, stunner, slaughter line, spray wash. Single words, a handful of words, very punctuated, right? Like the act of slaughtering an animal. It's just hitting him like a literal hammer. These words appear in his head and strike him, destroy him. But they're not just words. They're the blood, the dense smell, the automation, the absence of thought. So not only are we giving the literal meaning of these words, we are explaining even more detail of how these affect Marcos. They burst in on the night, as a nightmare essentially. Catch him off guard. When he wakes, his body is covered in a film of sweat, because he knows that what awaits him is another day of slaughtering humans. Fantastic opening paragraph that tells you everything you need to know about what to expect from this novel. It starts off with visceral, punchy language, and then proceeds to show how it affects a man named Marcos. And then the final line, he knows that what awaits is another day of slaughtering humans. So beautiful stuff. I was hooked immediately. If that doesn't hook you, I don't know what will. Maybe you're disgusted by the subject matter, which is totally understandable. So let us talk about the second paragraph. This kind of exemplifies what I was talking about the very plain language. So no one calls them that, he thinks, as he lights a cigarette. He doesn't call them that when he has to explain the meat cycle to a new employee. They could arrest him for it, even send him to the municipal slaughterhouse and process him. So again, here's where we're getting the more expository stuff. But again, it doesn't bother me, because I'm just so transfixed on what's going on here. And then we're interspersed with action next. While he removes his soaked shirt, he tries to clear the persistent idea that this is what they are. Humans bred as animals for consumption. He goes to the refrigerator and pours himself cold water. He drinks it slowly. His brain warns him that there are words that cover up the world. I mean, come on. This is good stuff. Anybody, if you're a writer, you can learn from this. If you are a reader, this is why you are captivated, because it is just a beautiful blend of exposition, simple, effective prose that speak more than what the words say on the page. And the final next punchy one sentence or two sentence paragraph, there are words that are convenient, hygienic, legal. I don't know, the writing to me, it feels somewhat like Cormac McCarthy, but more accessible. I feel like with Cormac McCarthy, sometimes I find myself not quite comprehending what's going on and having to go back, even though he uses plain language. So as you can see, beautiful writing, effective prose, and this is how it is for the entirety of the novel. It just feels clean, it's tight, it doesn't feel like there's extraneous words, extraneous plot points. Everything feels like it should be there. And this again, it's all under, I think it's under 300 words, and so that's again why I find myself gravitating towards shorter novels, because they just feel like there's no more waste. So what is this book about anyway? I know there's been some talk about it. I haven't read any articles, but I've seen, when I visited the Wikipedia page, I saw some people talking about its, the commentary on capitalism. And I typically don't really analyze literature this much, but like I said, this book really got me to think, and so I started thinking about what all of this means. And really what I got out of it is the lengths as humans we will go to for survival. And not only that, but how we segregate each other, how we can look at each other as separate groups who are less than human. And not only that, but how we can acclimate ourselves to the most disturbing situations sometimes. So this book is not at all about cruelty to animals. It's not about factory farming. It's not trying to make a commentary on that whatsoever. I really think this makes us look back at ourselves and what a terrible, terrible species we can be, and what horrible situations we not only create, but can somehow live in with some sense of normalcy. So on that note, I'm going to have to give Tender is the Flesh a 9 out of 10. One of my favorite novels I've read in a long time. I can imagine myself going back to this. This book, again, is going to stay with me for a very long time. This book is not for everybody, though. Let me make that very clear. If you have a weak stomach, not that anything is gratuitous here. But if you have a weak stomach, if you're emotionally unstable in any way, maybe this is not something you want to read. But I think if you give it time, if you give it patience, and if you understand what you're getting yourself into, you're going to get a lot out of this novel. As writers, what can we learn from this? If you are a writer, I think that we can learn the power of simplicity, right? I myself sometimes get a little too flowery with the way I write, and I'm constantly trying to pull it back, clean it up, and this is a great reminder of a book that just embodies that entire concept, but again, still manages to have beauty in the prose, and it's not only its simplicity, but like I said, there's some amazing metaphors in this book. And also, I think this can teach us to be more reserved in our writing. This novel could have gone to very dark, very descriptive places, but it didn't. Yes, you do learn how humans are processed, but it's done in the most tasteful way I suppose you could do, considering the circumstances and the subject matter. And also, this is a masterclass in taking something that is a very taboo subject and putting some meaning behind it, giving a reason for going to somewhere that is so dark. And character is king in this. Again, we are reminded of it because I was glued to the page, even though the plot itself is very non-existent, really. I mean, as I said, we have Marcos kind of going place to place. There is a plot that happens at the midpoint that drives it to the final climax. But other than that, it's just kind of a tour of this world. But that is the end of the review. I highly suggest you read this book if you can. If you have an open mind, pick it up and I will guarantee you'll probably never forget it. So if you'd like to support this channel, give me a like if you liked the video. Subscribe for story-related content. If you'd like to discuss this story or any other story, come to my Discord. It's free to join. The link is in the description below. And also, I have novels. You can purchase them in the links as well down below. Sign up for my newsletter for all my updates. And thanks for hanging out with me, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. So welcome to the spoiler section. And again, if you are making it this far, hopefully you've read the book or you want to hear what I thought more spoilery, and specifically the end, because I think the character arc here is quite important. So I'll read the final lines. And if you've read the book, you will know that he does end up killing the woman who he has impregnated at the very end. He calls his wife home to help him deliver the baby, and it seems to be something has snapped within him. And at first, when I read this line, so he's dragging the body of the female to the barn to slaughter it. He says to Cecilia, his voice radiant, so pure it wounds. She had the human look of a domesticated animal. Now, I think there's a lot to talk about in that line. I don't really know how to parse that, honestly. Like, it's kind of difficult. She had the human look of a domesticated animal. I don't know if that means he saw the humanity in someone like a domesticated animal, or if the lines are blurring. Again, I'm not an expert at dissecting lines like this, but what's interesting to me from a character arc standpoint is how this entire time he's impregnated this woman. You think he's going to live happily ever after. You think he's going to live in secret with a new child. You think that is going to replace his son and his wife is gone for good. But he reaches out to her at the last moment, brings her back into the fold, into his family. They have a boy, so it completes the cycle. He has a new son to replace his old one. And then he immediately looks at this woman as cattle, which I think is the opposite of what we've been led to believe throughout the entirety of this thing, even though that is his job. He works at a slaughterhouse, a processing plant. He sees this stuff go on day in and day out, but we're constantly reminded that he's disgusted by this stuff. He doesn't eat the meat. He's always eating vegetables or fruit or something other than this meat. And through his observations, we do see this disgust. We see it, in his body language, in his interior monologue, all of these things. But at the very end, he kind of does a 180, and he kills this woman just like she is cattle, takes the baby as his own, and then wants to get back with his wife. And his wife immediately responds, when he does that, why'd you do that? Why'd you kill her? She could have given us more children. It didn't seem like it was going this way whatsoever. You thought you were in Marcos's head. You thought you knew him. And at the very last second, he snapped into what seems like everybody else in this world. And again, I think this really goes back to how we can acclimate, how something can hold power over us more so than this crazy world we live in. So in that instance, it's his family. It's his son, his lost son, is enough to hypnotize him or wash away all of the horror that he is experiencing on every day, and he forgets about it, and he relegates this woman who he has tried to make human, essentially, right? Throughout the story, he lets her watch TV, he puts clothes on her, he feeds her like a regular person, and then at the last second, he treats her like an animal. So it's a really interesting arc or lack of arc, I guess you could say. You kind of think Marcos is going one way, and at the very last second, literally the very last second, the last few paragraphs of this, he flips. And I can see how that can be jarring for a lot of people. Some reviews I saw said it felt out of character. But I think it really speaks volumes to how we can turn on a dime sometimes, how we can have something that means more than something else, and it just erases everything. My guess would be, however, that this feeling would eventually wear off once things return back to normalcy, once he has his family, his child, his wife together. He's going to get in that rut all over again. At least that's what I can imagine. I mean, it's one of those things where I've known people in my life who are in a terrible relationship, and then they have a child, and all of a sudden everything is perfect again. And inevitably that relationship deteriorates back to where it came from because the thing they had in common with each other, the commonality of happiness, has lost its luster. And so I can imagine Marcos in this situation falling back into how we knew him from the beginning of the book just up until the end of the book. But I thought I would talk about it because I know there was some controversy over the final line or how the book ended. But I think that's my perspective, is that there's just some things that are important than others. They can make us forget other things. And in this case, they made Marcos forget that he is slaughtering humans, and that thing that made him forget is his son, reborn again. So thanks for hanging out with me for the spoilery section. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Hopefully it wasn't too rambly. Hopefully I convinced you to maybe take a second look. Thank you as always for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.